Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mitchell grabbed the radio from Emily's hand and threw it against the wall of the briefing tent. "You don't speak unless I ask you to speak," he said, his voice cold and flat, the kind of cold that had no apology behind it. "You're a radio operator. Act like one." Every man in that tent heard it. Every man in that tent stayed silent. Emily Carter didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked at the broken radio on the ground and said nothing. And that moment, that single humiliating moment, was the moment that would change everything. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. There is a particular kind of invisible that has nothing to do with size or silence or the way a person moves through a room. It is the invisible that happens when the world has already decided who you are before you open your mouth. Emily Carter had lived inside that kind of invisible for 7 years. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall with dark hair. She kept pulled back in a regulation braid and brown eyes that most people never bothered to look at long enough to remember. She had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Kestrel in the Kunar province of Afghanistan for 11 months. She had never missed a shift. She had never filed a complaint. She had kept every radio on that base functional through 3 sandstorms, 2 hard freezes, and 1 mortar attack that had taken out the backup generator and left the entire Eastern Communications array dead for 47 minutes. She had fixed it in 41. Nobody talked about that. What they talked about instead, when they talked about Emily Carter at all, was that she was quiet, that she stayed in her corner of the communications bay, that she ate alone sometimes, that she ran 5 miles every morning before the base woke up, which some of the guys found strange because nobody told her to, nobody asked her to, and she never made a show of it. She just did it. And then she came back, showered, showed up to work, did her job. That was Emily Carter, as far as most people at FOB Kestrel understood her, except for one man. Master Chief David Reynolds had been watching her for 6 weeks before he said anything. Reynolds was 53 years old, and he had spent 31 of those years in special operations. He had been in places that didn't have names on any map that civilians were allowed to see. He had worked alongside men who had since become legends, and he had buried men who deserved to be legends, but never got the chance. He knew people. He knew what a trained person looked like when they were trying not to look trained, and Emily Carter was one of the most trained people he had ever watched try to hide it. He first noticed it during a fire drill in October. Standard base evacuation, everybody moves to their designated assembly point, the usual noise and confusion and soldiers grumbling about the interruption. Emily had moved to her assembly point in exactly the right way. Not the way soldiers move when they're following a drill, not the shuffling, half-awake compliance of people who've done something so many times it stopped meaning anything. She moved the way people move when they're reading everything around them at the same time. She had checked the eastern ridgeline before she cleared the door of the communications bay. She had checked it again halfway across the assembly yard, and she had positioned herself without appearing to position herself in a spot where she had sight lines to 3 different approach vectors, and her back was never exposed. Reynolds had watched all of that happen in about 45 seconds, and he had stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand, thinking, who is she? He looked up her file that same afternoon. Emily Marie Carter, Communications Specialist MOS 25U, enlisted at 22. Prior to enlistment, no military service, no law enforcement background, no listed specialized training. Father Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter, United States Army, retired on medical grounds after his 3rd deployment, deceased 4 years after retirement. Cause of death, cardiac failure. Reynolds read that last line twice. Daniel Carter. He set down his coffee. He had known Daniel Carter, not well, not the kind of friendship that survives distance and deployment, but well enough to have shared a fire and a conversation on a cold night in Kandahar province when they were both younger men who still believed that war had logical edges. Daniel Carter had been one of the finest marksmen Reynolds had ever seen in a field setting. The Army had called him exceptional. The men who served with him had called him something quieter and more true than that. They had called him honest. Because the gift Daniel Carter had wasn't just in his hands, or his eyes, or the cold mathematical patience that made a great sniper. It was in his refusal to waste what he was given. He never took a shot he wasn't sure of. He never confused precision with cruelty. And when Reynolds had asked him once on that cold night in Kandahar whether he ever thought about what he was training his daughter to do, Daniel Carter had looked into the fire for a long moment and said, "I'm not training her to shoot David. I'm training her to see." Reynolds had filed that away for years without understanding it. Now looking at Emily Carter's service record and thinking about the way she had moved across that assembly yard this morning, he thought he finally understood it. He also understood something else. Whatever Daniel Carter had given his daughter, she was working very hard to keep it from anyone who might use it. And Reynolds had enough years and enough wisdom to know that the right move was not to push. Not yet. He would watch, and he would wait. Emily's shift ended at 2200 hours on a Tuesday in November, and she was doing what she usually did after shift, which was sitting on the eastern side of the base on a flat piece of concrete that had once been the foundation of something and now was nothing, looking out at the mountains. She wasn't doing anything that would have looked dramatic or meaningful to anyone watching. She was just sitting, her elbows on her knees, her hands loose, her eyes on the dark shapes of the peaks against the darker shape of the sky. But she was counting. She did it without thinking about it, the way other people breathe without thinking about it. She was counting the distances between things. The ridgeline above the northern valley was approximately 2,200 meters from where she sat. The secondary ridge, the one that jutted out at the crooked angle that always reminded her of a broken arm, was closer. Maybe 1,600. The shadow on the far left that could be a rock formation or could be a man. If a man knew how to hold still, long enough, she estimated 800 meters, and she noted without meaning to, that the wind was coming from the northwest at about 12 miles per hour and shifting. She stopped herself. She pressed her palms flat against the cold concrete. This was the thing she fought every day. The way her father's training lived in her body like a second nervous system, running quietly in the background of everything she did, cataloging and calculating and measuring without her permission. She didn't want it. She had spent 7 years learning not to want it. She had built an entire life inside the structures of military service precisely because those structures gave her enough to do that she could keep the other thing quiet. She was a communications specialist. That was real. That was chosen. That was hers. She was not a sniper. She was not her father's daughter in the way that the uniform would define it. She was not that. She pressed her palms harder against the concrete and made herself think about the eastern array adjustment she needed to complete before 0600 and the weather report that suggested increased interference in the UHF band over the next 72 hours, and the supply requisition she still hadn't submitted. She thought about those things until the mountains were just mountains again. Then she went to bed. The convoy briefing happened on a Thursday 9 days before Christmas in the largest tent on the eastern side of the base. It was a standard pre-mission briefing for what was being described as a routine operation. A convoy would move through the Korengal Valley approach to resupply a smaller outpost approximately 60 kilometers to the northeast. Intelligence suggested the route was clear. The SEAL element attached to the mission had conducted reconnaissance 48 hours prior and reported no significant enemy activity along the primary and secondary routes. Emily was assigned to the mission as forward communications operator. She had not requested the assignment. It had come through the standard rotation, and she had accepted it the way she accepted every assignment, which was to say that she had nodded, marked her copy of the order, and begun preparing her equipment. The briefing room was organized the way briefing rooms always were, with the officers and senior enlisted at the front, and the support personnel further back, and Emily sat in the third row from the back, with her notepad and her pen and her careful, quiet attention. The SEAL element was led by Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mitchell. Ryan Mitchell was 37 years old, and he looked like the kind of man who had been built specifically for the job he was doing. He was broad and lean at the same time, the kind of physical combination that comes from years of training that isn't about performance, it's about function. He had a scar along his jaw that had faded to silver. He had the measured economical movement of someone who has learned not to waste anything, including his own body. I was also in Emily's assessment, formed in the first 90 seconds of watching him, a man who had been right so many times in the field that he had started to believe being right was a character trait rather than a habit that needed constant maintenance. She had known men like that. Her father had warned her about men like that, not because they were bad men. Ryan Mitchell was not a bad man. She understood that immediately and completely and without sentimentality. I was a dangerous man, and the specific danger he represented was the danger of competence without humility, which was the military equivalent of a very sharp knife with no handle. He was going over the terrain maps when Emily leaned forward and raised her hand. There was a brief pause in the room. People did not generally interrupt Ryan Mitchell during a briefing. The secondary ridge, Emily said, keeping her voice even. The formation at grid reference, she checked her notepad. At grid reference Delta 7, the northeastern face. I'm not seeing it addressed in the defensive assessment. Mitchell looked at her, really looked at her the way people look at someone they weren't expecting to speak. You have a concern about a secondary ridge formation, he said. Yes, sir. The angle of the northeastern face provides approximately a 2,000-meter sightline down into the primary approach corridor. If the enemy element that was reported in the Siwan district 3 weeks ago has repositioned north, the Siwan element was assessed as having withdrawn across the border, Mitchell said. That assessment came from JSOC intelligence. Yes, sir, I read the assessment. And your objection is based on what? Your experience in tactical ground operations. The room was very quiet. Emily held his gaze. My objection is based on the terrain, sir. The ridge provides cover and concealment on 3 sides with a clean approach from the northwest. If I were choosing a position for an ambush, I would choose that position. There was a beat of silence in which the air in the tent seemed to change temperature. Ryan Mitchell looked at her for a moment longer, and then something closed behind his eyes like a door being pulled shut. You're the comms operator, he said. Do you know what that means? Yes, sir. It means your job is the radio, not the tactical assessment, not the terrain analysis, the radio. He looked around the room briefly, and his voice didn't rise, didn't need to. If I want your opinion on something I ask for, I'll ask. Until then, let's keep everyone in their lanes, understood? Yes, sir, Emily said, and she sat back, and she picked up her pen, and she wrote something on her notepad that nobody else in that tent could see. What she wrote was Northeast Ridge, Delta 7, 200 meters wind, Indian 14 mile per hour, 4 possible positions, adjust for coal barrel drift. She folded the notepad closed, and she waited. After the briefing in the narrow corridor between 2 tent structures, Ryan Mitchell stopped her. She had been expecting it, or something like it. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had done something visible, which for a person who had spent 7 years being invisible, amounted to the same thing. And Carter, he said. She stopped, turned. I don't need second guessing in my briefings, he said. I especially don't need it from support personnel who haven't been in a field position. Understood, sir. He took a half step closer, not threatening, just the body language of a man who was accustomed to taking up space. Because I've seen what happens when comms operators decide they understand the tactical picture. I've seen people die because someone who should have been on the radio was trying to be something they weren't. Emily looked at him. She thought about her father, about a night when she was 15 years old and they were lying in a field in rural Virginia, both of them on their stomachs in the grass, and he was walking her through the calculation for a 600-meter shot in crosswind. And he had said to her in his quiet, careful voice, the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is someone who knows just enough to be confident and not enough to be right. She thought about that. And then she said very quietly, I understand, sir. I won't bring it up again. She walked away, and she felt his eyes on her back for the full length of that corridor. That night, she called her mother. This was the one consistency in Emily's life that had survived every deployment, every reassignment, every quiet month in a base that the rest of the world didn't know existed. She called her mother every Sunday and every Thursday, and she had only missed 3 times in 11 months, twice for operational blackouts, and once for a fever that had put her in the medical bay for 36 hours. Her mother, Patricia Carter, was 61 years old and lived in a small house in eastern Tennessee that still had her husband's fishing rods in the garage because she hadn't been able to move them yet, and they had been there for 6 years. You sound strange, her mother said, after they had talked for a few minutes about the weather and about Patricia's neighbor whose cat had gotten into the bird feeder again. I'm fine, Emily said. You sound like your father used to sound before he was going somewhere he didn't want to talk about. Emily was quiet for a moment. There's a mission tomorrow, she said. A dangerous one. She stopped, started again. Mom, did Dad ever talk to you about the way he read terrain? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Terrain, Patricia said. Yeah, like the way he would look at a map and see things that other people didn't see, or look at a landscape and understand it differently. Another pause. Longer. Emily and her mother said, "What's happening?" "Nothing, Mom. I saw something today in the briefing, something I don't think anyone else noticed. And I said something about it, and I was told to mind my business. And, and I'm trying to figure out if I was wrong." "Were you?" Emily pressed the phone harder against her ear and looked out the small window of her quarters at the dark shapes of the mountains. "No," she said. "Then you weren't wrong." "But they don't listen, Mom. They look at me and they see a radio operator. They see someone in a support role. They don't see." She didn't finish that sentence. Her mother finished it for her. "They don't see what your father put into you," Patricia said. "Is that what you mean?" "Yes." "Then make them see it," her mother said. "That's what your father would have done. Dad never hid what he was." "No," Patricia said quietly. "He didn't. And that scared me every day for 17 years. But you know something, the thing that scared me more than him using his gift was the idea of him trying to live without it. That's a different kind of pain, Emily. That one doesn't go away when the mission's over." Emily didn't say anything. "Come home safe," her mother said. "Yes, ma'am," Emily said. She hung up the phone. She lay on her bunk in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. She was not thinking about her father's rifle. She was thinking about the ridge, about the angle, about the northwest wind, about the cold barrel drift that nobody had calculated because nobody in that briefing room knew they needed to. She was thinking about 12 miles per hour. She was thinking about 14. She was thinking about the way those four possible positions on the face of that ridge would be lit or not lit by the angle of the morning sun. She was doing the math that nobody had asked her to do, and she was afraid of herself for doing it. She fell asleep at 01:30. At 03:45, she was awake again, not because of an alarm, but because of a sound. It was a soft sound, the kind of sound that doesn't register as a threat until the part of your brain that was trained to register threats has already processed it and sent the alert up the chain. Footsteps outside her quarters that moved in a particular pattern. Measured, careful, not the random movement of someone heading to the bathroom or returning from a late shift. The measured, careful movement of someone who was paying attention to where they put their feet. Emily was already sitting up when the knock came. 3 knocks, deliberate spacing. She crossed the room and opened the door. Master Chief David Reynolds was standing in the corridor, looking exactly as awake as she felt. "Carter," he said. "Master Chief, may I come in?" She stepped back. He came in. She closed the door. He looked at her for a moment in the low light, the way she had seen him look at things from across the yard on those mornings when she had noticed him noticing her. "I knew your father," he said. The words landed in the room and changed everything. Emily stood very still. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter," Reynolds said. "We served together in Kandahar 2003. Not for long, maybe 3 weeks of overlap, but long enough." "He never mentioned you," Emily said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "He probably wouldn't have. He wasn't a man who talked about the job when he was away from it." Reynolds looked at her. "He talked about you, though." Emily's chest did something she wasn't prepared for. She kept her face even. "What did he say?" she asked. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "He said you were the most naturally gifted student he had ever worked with, and he had worked with some exceptional people." He paused. "He also said that you would have to decide for yourself what to do with it, that he couldn't make that choice, that it wasn't his to make." "He was right," Emily said. "It's not his to make." "No, it isn't." Reynolds looked down for a moment, then back up. "Carter, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not your commanding officer on this mission. I don't have that authority." "Then what are you here for, Master Chief?" "I'm here because I watched you in that briefing today, and I watched you see something that nobody else in that room saw." He held her gaze. "And I've been doing this long enough to know that the person who sees what nobody else sees is the person who needs to be heard when it matters." Emily looked at him. "They didn't hear me," she said. "No, they didn't. But I did," he paused. "And I want you to know that if tomorrow goes wrong in the way that I suspect you think it might go wrong, I want you to do what needs to be done, whatever that looks like. I'm a communications operator, Master Chief." "Emily," he said, It was the first time he had used her name. It landed differently than she expected. Emily, he said again, your father taught you to see. Don't pretend you're blind. He left. She stood in the center of her room for a long time after he was gone. Then she sat on the edge of her bunk. Then she leaned over and pulled her personal gear bag from beneath it, and she unzipped it, and she moved aside the spare uniform, and the extra socks, and the small worn photograph of her parents from their wedding day, and she reached to the very bottom of the bag. She pulled out a small notebook. It was her father's. He had given it to her when she was 17 after one of their training sessions. He had pressed it into her hands and said, everything I know is in here. Keep it. You'll need it when I'm not around to explain. She had it for 12 years and never opened it on deployment. She opened it now. The handwriting was her father's. Small and precise and slanted slightly to the left the way his always was. She read the first page, then the second. Then she closed the notebook. She sat with it in her hands for a long moment. She thought about what Reynolds had said. She thought about what her mother had said. She thought about Ryan Mitchell throwing the radio against the wall of the briefing tent, and the way the room had gone quiet, and the way she had looked at the broken radio on the floor and said nothing. She thought about the ridge at grid reference Delta 7. She thought about the 4 positions, the northwest wind, the morning light, the cold barrel drift, and she thought about one more thing. She thought about what her father had said to her on a hunting trip in the mountains of eastern Tennessee when she was 14 years old. She had just made a difficult shot, a very difficult shot. And she had turned to her father expecting praise and instead found him watching her with an expression she had never been able to fully name. She had asked him, was that good, Dad? And he had said, Emily, that was inevitable. The question was never whether you could do it. The question is what you'll choose to do with what you can do. She hadn't understood then. She thought she was starting to understand now. She put the notebook back in her bag. She lay back down on her bunk. And she did not sleep for the rest of the night. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, working through the calculations she had been doing since the briefing. Range, elevation, wind speed, wind direction, temperature effect on ballistics, angle of approach from each of the 4 positions on the ridge face. She ran the numbers, then she ran them again and again. And when the base began to stir at 0530, when the first sounds of engines and voices in the soft mechanical business of a military installation, getting ready for a day that would change everything, began to filter through the walls of her quarters, Emily Carter was already dressed. She was already ready. She did not yet know exactly what she was ready for. But she was ready, and the mountains outside were still dark and still and holding their secrets, the way mountains always do, the way her father had always said they would, right up until the moment they didn't. She found Reynolds before the convoy assembled. He was at the motor pool checking something on one of the vehicles with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had checked 10,000 vehicles before this one and knew that the one time you didn't check was the time it mattered. She walked up beside him. Master Chief, she said. He didn't look up from what he was doing. Carter. I've been running calculations, she said. I know. On the ridge, the 4 positions. I know. She was quiet for a moment. If something happens, she said, if they're wrong about the route, if the Shiwan element repositioned, if those positions are occupied. What about it? Reynolds said. I'll need access to the team's equipment. I'll need the spotter's scope in the backup rifle kit. Reynolds straightened up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, it's already on the vehicle. Emily looked at him. I added it to the manifest yesterday, he said. Personal initiative. Nobody's going to question it before we roll. She kept looking at him. Thank you, she said. He shook his head. Don't thank me, he said. Just do your job. She nodded. She walked back toward the assembly area. And behind her, David Reynolds looked at the mountains for a long moment, thinking about a night in Kandahar, and a fire and a man who had told him about his daughter. And he hoped quietly and completely that Daniel Carter was watching, because if he was, Reynolds thought he would see something worth seeing, something he had spent years teaching, something that had taken 7 years to find its way back, and the valley ahead was just beginning to fill with light. The convoy rolled out at 0615. 6 vehicles, 2 gun trucks at the front and rear, 3 transport vehicles in the middle carrying supplies and the communications equipment Emily was responsible for, and 1 command vehicle second from the front where Ryan Mitchell sat with his team and the mission plan he was entirely confident in. Emily was in the fourth vehicle. She sat between two soldiers who didn't speak much, which suited her. She had her radio equipment checked and secured. She had her headset on. She had the frequency band calibrated to the 3 channels they would need for the mission: the primary, the secondary, and the emergency backup that nobody wanted to use. And behind her seat, secured under a canvas cover that nobody had looked at twice, was the equipment David Reynolds had added to the manifest. She did not look at it. She looked at the road. The convoy moved through the lower valley in the early morning light, and Emily watched the terrain the way she had been watching terrain since she was old enough to understand what her father was teaching her. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of movies where the soldier narrows their eyes and sees the threat before anyone else, with the music swelling underneath. It was quieter than that and more exhausting. It was the constant, low-level attention of someone who had been taught that the landscape was always telling you something, and the only question was whether you were listening. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. The road through the lower valley was open and flat, and the intelligence reports had been correct about the primary route. Emily tracked the radio traffic, confirmed check-ins with the rear element, noted the slight degradation in signal quality as they moved into the first shadow of the larger peaks, and adjusted her frequency without being told to. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, the team's communications NCO, was sitting in the command vehicle, and he was the one who was supposed to be managing the overall communications picture. He was competent and experienced, and he and Emily had developed a working relationship over the past 11 months that was built on mutual professional respect and almost no personal conversation. He trusted her with the forward radio because she was the best they had. He just didn't know why she was the best they had. Nobody did. She heard his voice in her earpiece at the 22-minute mark. "Carter, how's your signal quality on the secondary?" "Degrading slightly as we move into the valley shadow. I'm sitting at about 73%. I'll boost at the next waypoint." "Copy that. Primary's reading clean on my end." "Affirm." She went back to watching. At the 30-minute mark, she noticed something. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that would make a person gasp or grab the arm of the soldier next to them. It was the kind of thing that makes a person go very still on the inside, the way a body of water goes still right before the weather changes. She saw a bird. Specifically, she saw a bird that wasn't there. The northeastern ridgeline was host to a particular species of mountain bird that she had seen every morning for 11 months from her position on the eastern side of the base. They moved in the early morning along the ridge faces, hunting insects in the warming rock. They were loud and visible, and they had a specific flight pattern that she had learned without meaning to learn it, the way you learn the sound of a particular person's footsteps in a hallway. The ridge at grid reference Delta 7 should have had birds on it. It didn't. The entire face of that ridge was silent. Emily keyed her radio. "Webb, this is Carter. I'm seeing no bird movement on the northeastern face of Delta 7. Over." There was a pause. "Carter, say again." "The northeastern ridge face, Delta 7, no bird movement. That face should be active at this time of morning." "I'm seeing nothing. Over." Another pause. Longer. "Carter, are you reporting wildlife activity as a tactical concern?" She heard something in his voice that was not quite amusement. More like the careful neutrality of a man who was deciding how to respond to something that his framework didn't have a category for. "Affirm," she said. "Something displaced the wildlife on that face. Displacement at this hour and at that elevation suggests human presence." Over. The pause this time was longer. She waited. Then Mitchell's voice came on the channel. Hard and flat, and with no space in it for discussion. "Carter, maintain radio discipline. Your job is comms. Webb, resume normal traffic." Emily took her finger off the transmit button. She looked out the window at the ridge. The ridge looked back at her, somewhere up there in one of the 4 positions she had calculated the night before. Something was waiting. She could feel it the way she had always felt things she wasn't supposed to feel. The way her father had said some people could feel the math of a situation before they could name it. She pressed her hand flat against her knee and breathed. The convoy moved deeper into the valley. The ridge stayed silent. At the 41-minute mark, the road curved northeast. Emily had studied this section of the route. She knew that the curve would bring the convoy into a corridor that was approximately 300 meters wide at its narrowest point, flanked on both sides by elevated terrain. For approximately 4 minutes of travel time, The convoy would be moving through that corridor with no ability to deviate significantly from the road, and with elevated positions on both sides capable of commanding direct fire down into the vehicles. It was exactly the kind of corridor that an enemy element with elevated positions would wait for. She keyed her radio. "Webb, this is Carter. We're approaching the narrow section at Waypoint Golf. I'm requesting a halt for Carter." Mitchell's voice cut across hers. "Do not transmit non-essential traffic on this channel." "It's not non-essential, sir. Waypoint Golf is a natural choke point with elevated positions on—" "Carter," his voice was colder now. "I will not ask again. Maintain radio discipline." She stopped transmitting. The vehicle ahead of her slowed slightly as the road curved. The corridor opened up ahead of them. Emily looked at the left ridgeline. She looked at the right ridgeline. She looked at Delta 7, which was now to the northeast, partially visible above the road cut. The ridge was still silent. Something in her chest tightened into a fist. She reached back, slowly, naturally, the way you reach for something you've always reached for. She pulled the canvas cover aside just enough to confirm what was underneath. The rifle kit was there. The spotter's scope was there. She didn't touch either of them. Not yet. Not yet. The convoy entered the corridor. The walls of elevated terrain rose on both sides. Emily watched the sky between the ridge lines and counted seconds. 1, 2, 3. She got to 9. The world came apart. The first RPG hit the lead gun truck. Not a full strike, it caught the front left quarter, and the vehicle lurched and stopped blocking the road. And before the sound had even finished rolling through the valley, the incoming fire started from 3 separate elevated positions simultaneously. And the noise was enormous and immediate, and every soldier in the convoy went from mission normal to combat survival in the space of a single breath. Emily's vehicle lurched to a stop. The driver was already yelling into his radio. The soldiers on both sides of her were in motion door handles, weapons up training, cutting through shock. Emily did not move for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which she was perfectly still while everything around her was chaos. And in those 2 seconds, she located 3 of the 4 firing positions she had predicted the night before. Then she moved. She came out of the vehicle on the left side, low and fast, moving to the rear of the vehicle, where the angle gave her the most cover from the primary fire. She had her sidearm. She had her radio. She had her headset miraculously still on. Webb's voice was in her ear, urgent and controlled. All elements were taking fire from elevated positions, northeastern sector. Lead vehicle is disabled. I need status from all call signs. Voices came back, overlapping, some clear, some broken by static. Emily was already back at the vehicle door. She reached in. She pulled out the canvas-wrapped kit. She moved to the rear of the vehicle. She unwrapped it. The rifle was a MK-21 precision sniper rifle, the modular variant that the SEAL teams had been using for field applications. It was not her preferred configuration. She had trained on a different platform, the one her father had used. But the mechanics were the same, and the math was the same, and her hands knew what to do without being asked. She set up behind the rear wheel of the vehicle. She mounted the scope. She found the first position. And then something happened that she hadn't planned for. Ryan Mitchell appeared around the front of the vehicle. He was moving low and fast toward the disabled lead truck, coordinating his team's return fire, and he nearly ran directly into her. He stopped. He looked at the rifle in her hands. He looked at her face. And for a long moment, with the sound of incoming fire making the air itself feel thick and wrong, the two of them looked at each other across a distance of about 4 feet. His expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, confusion, something that wasn't quite anger, more like a man whose world had just reorganized itself around information he hadn't had before. "What are you doing?" he said. "What needs to be done?" Emily said. "That weapon belongs to Sergeant Davis's down," she said. "I can see 3 of the 4 positions from this angle. If you have a better option, sir, I am absolutely open to hearing it." The fire from the ridge intensified. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. He looked at the ridge. "Can you actually do this?" he said. "Yes." "Not can you hold a rifle, Carter. Can you actually—" "My father was Daniel Carter," she said. The name landed in him like a physical thing. She watched it happen, watched his face change in the specific way that Daniel Carter's name always changed the faces of people who had been in this world long enough to know it. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter," she said. The army called him exceptional. The men who served with him called him the Shadow. She held Mitchell's gaze. He started training me when I was 11 years old. Now, sir, I need you to either move so I can work or tell me to stop and live with the outcome. Mitchell stared at her. 1 second. 2. Do it, he said. He moved. Emily turned back to the ridge. She settled into the position behind the rear wheel, adjusting her body to the support surface, feeling the old familiar geometry of it. The line from her shoulder through the stock, through the barrel, through the scope, to the target, all of it clicking into place like a combination lock that hadn't been opened in 7 years, but whose number she had never forgotten. She found the first position. 1,200 meters, slightly elevated. Wind from the northwest, she clocked it at 14 miles per hour based on the movement she had been tracking for the past 40 minutes. Cold barrel first shot adjustment needed. Her father's voice in her head, calm and specific and patient: account for the cold. Always account for the cold. The rifle tells you the truth eventually, but the first truth it tells is about temperature. She breathed out. She let the breath go completely. The world went quiet in the particular way it always had. She squeezed. The position went silent. She moved to the second position without pausing, without thinking, without allowing herself to think about what she had just done or what it meant or what it cost. She moved with the cold efficiency of someone who had been trained not by cruelty, but by love, which is the most effective kind of training there is because it doesn't leave room for doubt. Second position, 1,400 meters, different angle. Wind had shifted 2 degrees. She caught it in the way the incoming fire from that position had been drifting slightly left in its second burst. She adjusted, she breathed, she fired, and the second position went silent. In the command vehicle, someone's voice came over the radio. What is happening to their positions? Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and Emily was already moving to the third. The third position was the difficult one. She had known from her calculations the night before that the third position on the northeastern face of Delta 7 was the one that required the longest shot, the most complex wind adjustment, and the most patience, because the angle of that position relative to the convoy's location meant that the shooter there had partial cover from a rock formation and would need to be hit during a specific window of exposure. She had calculated that window. She had calculated it lying on her bunk at 0300 in the dark, with nothing but her father's training and 12 years of dormant instinct to work with. And she had gotten it right. She waited. The fire from the third position continued. Soldiers around her were returning fire, but the return fire wasn't finding the position. It was hitting the rock formation in front of the shooter and scattering without effect. She waited. Sergeant Webb's voice in her ear. We've got 2 injured up front. Need suppression on the northeastern face Delta 7 sector. Any element with a sight line I need. This is Carter, she said, her voice completely steady. I have it. Silence on the channel for a beat. Then Carter say again, I have Delta 7, stand by. The shooter at the third position shifted. It was tiny. It was the shift that any shooter makes when they're repositioning for a better angle when the targets below them have started moving in a pattern that suggests the old angle isn't optimal anymore. It exposed them for approximately 2 seconds. Emily had already begun her trigger pull. The third position went silent. The incoming fire from Delta 7 dropped by 3/4 in an instant. The radio's traffic from the team changed. Emily could hear it. The specific change in register that combat radio traffic makes when the tactical situation shifts, when the impossible starts becoming the possible, when trained soldiers who have been in defensive mode start to hear opportunity. Mitchell's voice, what is happening on that ridge? One of his team, Chief, I don't know. Their positions are just going quiet. Who has eyes on Delta 7? Nobody answered for a moment. And then Emily keyed her radio. This is Carter, she said. I have eyes on the ridge. The channel went completely silent. Mitchell's voice came back, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something in it that she had not heard before. Not awe exactly. Not the dramatic movie version of someone realizing they've underestimated a person. It was quieter than that and more real. It was the sound of a man who was very good at his job and acknowledging information that changed what he understood about the situation. Carter, he said, what's your status? 3 positions neutralized on the northeastern face. 4th position is southwestern, approximately 800 meters, taking advantage of the convoy's exposure on the left flank. Your element's return fire has been drawing their attention. If you can keep them engaged for 30 seconds, I can work around their cover. A pause. You have 30 seconds, Mitchell said. Copy, Emily said. She was already moving. She repositioned along the length of the vehicle, moving to the front quarter, where the angle to the southwestern position opened up. It was a harder shot from this position. The body of the vehicle cut into her sight line, and she would have to work from a slightly elevated angle using the vehicle's hood as a brace. She had never used this configuration before. She did the adjustment in her head in about 4 seconds. Her father's voice again: when the position isn't perfect, the math is still perfect. Trust the math. She trusted the math. She settled. She found the position. She heard Mitchell's team opening up with sustained fire to the southwest, keeping the shooter's attention forward, preventing the repositioning she needed to prevent. She breathed. She waited for the wind. The wind shifted slightly, the way it had been shifting all morning. The small cyclical variation she had been tracking since they entered the valley, and she caught the rhythm of it, and she waited for the right moment in the cycle. The moment came. She fired. 800 meters. The fourth position went silent. And then the valley was different. The incoming fire didn't stop instantly. There were other enemy elements further in the valley, lighter positions, individual fighters, who hadn't been part of the coordinated ambush from the ridge. The firefight continued, and it would continue for another 23 minutes before air support arrived and the remaining enemy forces withdrew. But the ridge was silent. The 4 positions that should have made this corridor a kill zone were neutralized. And the convoy that should have been destroyed was still fighting. Webb's voice on the radio, and she had never heard him sound like this before. Not in 11 months, this specific quality of a man trying to keep professionalism in his voice while processing something that his professionalism didn't have a category for all elements. The elevated threat at Delta 7 appears to be neutralized. I say again, the elevated threat at Delta 7 appears to be neutralized. A voice Emily didn't immediately recognize. By who? Nobody answered. Emily set the rifle down carefully, safely, the way her father had always taught her. Not dropped, not abandoned. Set down with the respect that a tool deserves when it has done what it was made to do. She picked up her radio. She resumed managing the communications, because she was the forward communications operator, and that was her job. And the convoy still needed to talk. Sergeant Webb found her 15 minutes later during a brief lull while they regrouped and tended to the injured. He came around the rear of her vehicle and stopped when he saw her. She was crouched next to the wheel headset on, working the secondary channel to confirm contact with the rear element. She heard him stop. She knew he was there. She finished the exchange before she looked up. He was looking at the rifle kit, which was still visible near the rear wheel. I was looking at it the way a person looks at something they understand individually but cannot reconcile collectively. Carter, he said. Sergeant, tell me that wasn't you. What wasn't me? The ridge. She looked at him. Yes, Sergeant, she said. It was me. Marcus Webb had been in the Army for 16 years. He had been in combat. He had seen things that had changed him in ways he would spend the rest of his life understanding. He was not a man who was easily shaken. He sat down against the wheel of the vehicle. He put his head back against the metal. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said 4 positions. In that time frame, with a coal barrel and valley wind. Yes. How my father was Daniel Carter. Webb turned his head and looked at her. I know that name, he said quietly. Most people who've been in long enough do. He trained you for 10 years, she said. Webb looked at the ridge for a moment. Why didn't you tell anyone, he said. Because I promised my mother I would never be what I was trained to be. He looked at her. Then why today, he said. Emily thought about that for a moment. She thought about Reynolds, about her mother, about her father's notebook, about the birds that weren't on the ridge this morning. Because some promises, she said, are less important than the people you'd be breaking them to protect. Webb was quiet. Then he said very simply, thank you. She nodded. She put her headset back on. She went back to work, and from the command vehicle 40 meters up the road, Ryan Mitchell watched the exchange from the corner of his eye and said nothing, and did not move, and did not stop watching until the air support arrived and the situation resolved, and there was finally, for the first time since the convoy entered the valley, something close to silence. He had things to say. I was not yet ready to say them, but he knew with the certainty of a man who had built his career on assessing situations accurately that everything he had decided about Emily Carter on the day he threw the radio against the wall of the briefing tent had been wrong. Not partly wrong, not wrong in the way of incomplete information, wrong in the foundational way, the kind of wrong that doesn't resolve with a correction, the kind that requires something harder. I was 37 years old, and he was very good at his job, and he had not been this wrong about a person in a very long time. He sat with that. The valley was quieter now. The ridge at Delta 7 was silent. And somewhere in the wreckage of the assumptions he had built about the woman in the fourth vehicle, something new was beginning to form. Something that felt uncomfortably and specifically like respect. He didn't say anything yet, but he looked at the ridge. And then he looked at Emily Carter, who was crouched by her vehicle working her radio with the same quiet competence she brought to every task, and he thought about a name. Daniel Carter, the shadow. And he thought about daughters, and about what a father can leave behind when he teaches not just the technique, but the reason for the technique. And he thought that maybe he had spent so many years measuring people by what they showed that he had forgotten to account for what they were carrying. The medevac bird was inbound. The rear element was holding. The mission would continue modified with the disabled lead vehicle recovered and the injured evacuated. They would reach the resupply outpost. They would complete the mission. And when they got back to Phobia B. Kestrel, there would be an after-action review and reports and the formal accounting that the military requires of all its events. The transformation of chaotic human experience into documented, analyzable data. And somewhere in that documentation, someone would have to write down what had happened on the northeastern face of Delta 7, and they would have to name who did it. And Ryan Mitchell, sitting in his command vehicle as the medevac came in over the ridge, was already thinking about what he was going to say, and about whether what he said would come close to accounting for what he had seen. He suspected it wouldn't. Some things don't fit in a report. Some things can only be said person to person, eye to eye, with nothing between you and the truth of what happened. He would find that moment. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. The bird came in over the ridge, and the valley filled with the sound of rotors. And Emily Carter, forward communications operator, covered her headset with one hand and kept the channel open and did her job, every bit of it. The medevac lifted out of the valley with 2 injured soldiers, and the sound of it faded slowly the way sounds fade in mountain terrain, bouncing off rock faces and diminishing in stages rather than all at once, until finally there was nothing left of it but the memory of the noise and the silence that replaced it. Emily sat with her back against the rear tire of her vehicle and did not move for a long time. Her hands were in her lap. Her headset was around her neck. The radio traffic had gone to a maintenance frequency, the operational urgency replaced by the quieter business of recovery and reorganization. And Webb was managing the primary channel from the command vehicle, which meant that for the first time in several hours, Emily Carter had nothing specific that she was required to do. She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She had expected them to shake. She remembered her father telling her once that the hands were the last to know that the body processed the reality of combat in stages and the extremities were always at the back of the line. He had told her that when she was 16 years old after a training session that had felt more serious than the ones before it, the kind of session where he wasn't just teaching her a skill, but preparing her for a weight she hadn't understood yet. She understood it now. The hands were not shaking, but something else in her was, something deeper than hands, something in the center of her chest that felt like a door she had kept locked for 7 years, had just been opened from the outside, and the air coming through it was cold and unfamiliar, and carried the smell of everything she had spent 7 years trying not to be. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. She breathed. She thought about her father. Not the training, not the technique, not the patient, precise voice that lived in her memory like a second conscience. She thought about his hands, about the way they had looked holding a cup of coffee on Sunday mornings when she was a child, before the deployments got longer and the returns got shorter, and the man who came home started to look more and more like a person who was visiting rather than a person who lived there. She thought about his laugh, which she almost never heard anymore, except in that specific corner of her memory where the early years lived. And she thought about the fishing rods that were still in her mother's garage. The fishing rods that neither of them had ever gotten around to using together. Because there had always been one more deployment, one more mission, one more thing that mattered more than a Sunday on a river. She pressed harder against her thighs. This was not the time. She knew that, She had always been good at knowing that. The grief had its place and its time in the valley in Afghanistan 40 minutes after a firefight, with 2 men airlifted out and a mission still to complete, was not that place and not that time. She put the headset back on. She checked the channel. She did her job. And that was what she was doing precisely and professionally when she heard footsteps coming around the rear of the vehicle and looked up and found Ryan Mitchell standing there. He was not moving with the operational purpose she had seen in him all morning. He was moving like a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, but was still working out exactly what the decision was going to cost him. She had seen that kind of movement before. Her father had moved that way sometimes. The particular walk of someone doing something hard by choice. He stopped about 3 feet from her. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then he sat down on the ground, not beside her, not in a way that suggested camaraderie or familiarity. He sat down like a man who had been on his feet for a long time and needed to be level with the person he was talking to. "Talk to me," he said. Emily looked at him. "About what, sir?" "About all of it." He paused. "About who you are." She studied his face. It was an open face right now in a way it hadn't been before. The closed-door quality she had noticed in the briefing was gone. What was there instead was something rawer. The face of a man who was reassembling his understanding of a situation and was willing to let her see him doing it. "I told you about my father," she said. "You said his name. That's not the same as telling me about him." She was quiet for a moment. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter," she said. "He served 3 combat deployments with the 75th Ranger Regiment, made the transition to the Army's Special Operations Sniper Program in 2001. They trained him to be the best because he already was." She kept her voice even and factual. "He had a particular ability with long-range precision shooting that his instructors said they had not seen in a student before. He could read wind the way other people read words on a page. He had a patience that most people in that program couldn't manufacture even with years of training. His instructors wrote in their evaluations that his gift was not technical, it was perceptual. He saw things other people didn't," Mitchell said. "Yes, and he taught you. From the time I was 11 years old," she paused. "He didn't tell my mother until I was 13. That was a difficult conversation." Something moved across Mitchell's face. Not quite a smile, more like the recognition of a human complexity that he hadn't been expecting. "What did she say?" he asked. "She said that if he was going to teach me to shoot, he had better teach me to think first." Emily paused. "He said he already was, that the thinking was the point." Mitchell looked at his hands for a moment. "How many years did you train?" he asked. "Until I was 21, 10 years. With gaps for his deployments, but he made up the gaps when he came back. We would go out to a property he had access to in eastern Tennessee, a ridge system with variable wind. He had range markers set up at distances from 300 meters out to 2,100. We would go out in all weather, summer heat, winter cold rain wind. He said a controlled environment teaches you technique, but a real environment teaches you truth." "I was right," Mitchell said. "He was usually right," Emily said. There was a beat of quiet. Then Mitchell said, "When did he die?" She looked at him. 6 years ago, she said. Cardiac failure, 4 years after his medical retirement. She held Mitchell's gaze. The Army broke things in him that a heart can't fix. The deployments did what deployments do. He came home, but he never fully came home. You know what I mean? Mitchell looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said, quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." She believed him. After he died, she said, "I made a promise to my mother. I told her I would serve because service was in me and I didn't know how to be anything else. But I told her I would not be my father's path. I would not become a weapon. I would find a different way to be useful." "So you became a comm specialist." "I became very good at something that had nothing to do with a rifle," she said. "And I was good at it. I am good at it. It's not a consolation prize, sir. I want to be clear about that. I chose communications because I am good at it and because it matters and because the work of keeping people talking when everything is trying to make them go silent, that work has value." "It does," Mitchell said, and he said it simply without the condescension she might have expected from him 24 hours ago. He said it like a fact. She looked at him steadily. "What I did today," she said, "I need you to understand that I did not do it to prove a point. I did not do it to show anyone that I was more than they thought I was. I did it because the alternative was watching people die on a ridge that I had predicted and that nobody listened to me about. The last part of that sentence landed in the space between them. Mitchell didn't flinch from it. You're right, he said. I know. You were right in the briefing. You were right about the ridge. You were right about the corridor. And I shut you down. He looked at her. I shut you down because I had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, and that is a failure of judgment that I am responsible for and that I will carry. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Part of her had expected those words to feel like a victory. Some small, tired part of her that had spent years being overlooked and underestimated had expected that an apology from Ryan Mitchell would feel like a score being settled. It didn't feel like that. It felt heavy. It felt like the weight of what the morning had cost distributed slightly differently between the two of them. And that was not a victory. That was just the truth of what happened when people made mistakes in environments where mistakes had prices. What happened to Sergeant Davis, she asked. Davis was the team's sniper, the one who had been injured in the initial RPG strike. GSW to the left arm, Mitchell said. He'll keep the arm. He'll recover. She exhaled. Okay, she said. The other man, Cortez, he took some shrapnel. He'll be all right. Good. Mitchell looked at his hands again for a moment. Carter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. I've been honest with you every time we've spoken, sir. He looked up at her. Fair point, he said. There was a very brief pause in which something shifted between them, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when the weather outside changes. Something that was tightly wound came slightly loose. There's a fourth position, she said. He went very still. I neutralized the 4 positions in the northern sector, she said. But my calculations last night identified a potential 5th position. It was a lower probability position. I weighted it at about 35% likelihood because the angle was awkward and the approach would have been difficult in darkness. During the firefight, I was managing the 4 primary positions, and by the time those were neutralized, the air support timeline had compressed and the remaining fighters in the lower valley withdrew under pressure. You think there's still a shooter at the 5th position? Mitchell said. I think there's a 35% chance, which in my experience is too high to ignore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. He looked at the western face of the approach road toward the position she was describing. Where, he said, approximately 1,100 meters. Rock formation on the western face secondary ridge. And the approach from the northwest would have been possible before dawn. It's a poor primary position because the sight line into the corridor is partially obscured by the road cut, but it becomes a very good secondary ambush position if the convoy attempt to withdraw the way they came in. Which is what we're going to do, Mitchell said. I know. He looked at her. You ran those numbers just now in your head during this conversation. I've been running them since we stopped, she said. He stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name. It was somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal. The look of a person trying to recalibrate. I'll brief my team, he said. I want you in the command vehicle for the withdrawal. Understood. He started to turn. Mitchell, she said. He stopped. My job is still comms, she said. What I did today was an exception that I hope I never have to make again. I need you to understand that. I'm not looking for a different role. He looked at her for a long moment. Carter, he said, after today I think you have earned the right to define your own role. He walked away, and Emily sat back against the tire and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for most of the day. The withdrawal prep took 37 minutes. During those 37 minutes, Emily managed communications with the rear element, coordinated the revised route confirmation with Webb, and ran the calculations for the potential 5th position 6 more times from 6 slightly different angles of approach. Each time she got a number between 32 and 38%. She told Reynolds when he appeared beside her vehicle with a canteen and a look of quiet, careful attention. 35, as she said, accepting the canteen. And your threshold for action, he asked. 20, she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the western ridgeline with the same steady, patient attention he brought to everything. You did well today, he said. 2 men were airlifted out, she said. They're alive, he said, because of what you did on that ridge. She drank from the canteen and handed it back. Master Chief, she said, did you know this was going to happen? He was quiet for a beat. I knew the conditions were right for something to happen, what he said. The intelligence picture had gaps that I didn't like. The route had characteristics that would have made me choose a different approach. He paused. I also knew that the team leading the mission wouldn't listen to concerns raised by support personnel, and that the one person on this convoy who understood the terrain well enough to predict the threat was not in a position where her input would be welcomed. So you put the rifle kit on the vehicle. I put the rifle kit on the vehicle, he said. She looked at him. You were ready to let this happen, she said. Not an accusation, a statement. I was ready to make sure that when it happened, you had what you needed to respond, he said. There's a difference. Is there? He looked at her steadily. Emily, he said, I've spent 31 years in this work, and the one lesson that costs the most to learn is that you cannot always prevent the thing from happening. Sometimes the best you can do is make sure the right person is there when it does. She held his gaze. You put me on this mission, she said. He didn't answer. She looked at him for a long moment. You put me on this mission, she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. The rotation was legitimate, he said carefully. Master Chief? A pause. I may have had some input into the assignment process, he said. She sat with that, the weight of it, the specific, complicated weight of realizing that a man who had known her father, had spent weeks watching her, had added equipment to a manifest without being asked, had arranged her assignment to a mission he believed was going to go wrong, and had done all of it without telling her. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her was angry in the clean, immediate way that you're angry when someone makes a decision about your life without including you. Part of her was something else, something closer to gratitude, which she resented feeling because the gratitude complicated the anger, and she wasn't ready to reconcile them yet. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said simply. I should have. She looked away. He trusted your judgment, Reynolds said. Your father. He told me on that night in Kandahar that if something happened to him, the thing he worried about most wasn't whether Emily would survive. He said she would survive. He knew that. What he worried about was whether she would find her way back to what she was. Whether she would let herself be it. Emily did not look at him. He said she might need someone to create the circumstances, Reynolds said. He said she wouldn't need much, just enough. She pressed her lips together. He said that, she said. Her voice was level, barely. In his words, give her the opening, she'll do the rest. The silence that followed was the kind that only exists between people who are both feeling something too large for the moment to contain. Emily looked at the western ridgeline. If there's a shooter at that position, she said. Yes, Reynolds said, and if the withdrawal route brings the convoy into the sight line of that position. Yes. Then I'll need a different setup from what I used this morning. The angle from the withdrawal route to that position is going to require elevation, not ground level. I'll need the hood of the lead vehicle or something comparable. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, then, I can make sure you're in the right vehicle. She almost laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has just understood the full shape of a situation and found it both impressive and infuriating. You know, she said, most people who want to help you just ask. Most people, Reynolds said, are not trying to help someone who has spent 7 years running from the thing they need most. She looked at him. He looked back. And she thought about her father on a cold night in Kandahar, talking to a man he barely knew about a daughter. He worried about leaving instructions in a conversation as casually as he had always left instructions in everything, because Daniel Carter had understood at some deep and patient level that the people you love sometimes need the door held open from a distance. Okay, she said. Okay, Reynolds said. He walked away. Emily put her headset back on. She resumed her frequencies. She worked the channels. And 37 minutes after the medevac had lifted away the convoy, began its withdrawal. Emily was in the lead vehicle. The withdrawal route brought them back through the lower valley by a slightly different path, avoiding the primary corridor, where the lead gun truck had been disabled and where the debris of the morning's firefight would slow their movement. The revised route ran along the western edge of the valley floor closer to the secondary ridgeline, which brought them approximately 940 meters from the rock formation that Emily had identified as the potential fifth position. She had calculated and recalculated that distance. She had also noted in the recalculation she had done while the convoy was prepping for withdrawal that the wind on the western side of the valley had a different character from the wind on the northeastern face. The valley floor funneled air from the south in the afternoon hours. She was looking at a crosswind component that her morning calculations hadn't needed to account for. She adjusted. She was ready. The convoy moved. At the 4-minute mark of the withdrawal, she saw it, the faintest possible indicator, the kind of thing that only registers if you have been looking for exactly that thing in exactly that location. A shift of light on the rock face, not the kind of shift that comes from cloud movement or atmospheric change, the kind that comes from the slight repositioning of something that doesn't belong there. She was out of her headset before she had finished processing the thought. "Stop the vehicle," she said. The driver looked at her. "Ma'am, stop the vehicle right now." He stopped. Behind them, the second vehicle nearly closed the gap before its driver caught the brake. Mitchell's voice immediately in her earpiece. "Why are we stopped?" "This is Carter. Potential contact at the secondary ridge western face. I need 30 seconds. "Carter, I don't have a contact on... Sir, I need 30 seconds. A pause that felt like it lasted a full minute. "You have 30 seconds, Mitchell said. She was already out of the vehicle. She came around to the front. She laid across the hood. Reynolds had positioned her in the right vehicle. She brought the rifle up. She found the position. She could barely see it. The shooter was well concealed, tucked into a natural fold in the rock that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for the angle she was looking for. But the shift she had seen was real, and now that she was in the scope, she could see the source of it. The barrel of a rifle, just the tip of it, extended far enough from the rock fold to establish a sight line down the withdrawal route. Her stomach went cold in the specific way it always went cold when the things she had predicted turned out to be true. 35%, not zero. She breathed, adjusted for the southern crosswind. The distance was 940 meters, and she had calculated it from a moving vehicle with a mental scope that she had been maintaining since the corridor, and she ran it one more time in the 3 seconds she had left. 940 meters, southern crosswind approximately 8 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees since morning. She adjusted for that. She adjusted for the elevation differential, which was less than she had encountered that morning. She adjusted for the partial obstruction, which meant she was aiming for a specific window of vulnerability in the shooter's cover. She breathed out completely. She waited for the wind cycle. She squeezed. The position went still. For a moment, nothing moved anywhere in the valley. Then Mitchell's voice very quietly, "Carter, report." "Fifth position neutralized," she said. "Western face secondary ridge, 940 meters." The silence on the channel lasted 4 full seconds. Then Webb's voice, and he couldn't keep all of it out. Some mix of disbelief and something that might have been reverence. "How did you see that?" She didn't answer. She got back in the vehicle. She put her headset on. "Convoy can resume withdrawal," she said. "The road is clear." Nobody argued. Nobody questioned. The convoy moved. And Emily Carter, forward communications operator, rode the rest of the withdrawal route in silence, watching the ridgelines that were no longer watching back, with her hands folded in her lap and a feeling in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something that sat between those two things and belonged fully to neither of them. It was the feeling of a door standing open that had been closed for 7 years, and the understanding that she would have to decide consciously and deliberately what to do about that. Her father had created the gift. Reynolds had created the circumstances. But the decision was hers. It had always been hers. She looked out the window at the mountains and thought about her father's voice saying, "The question is never whether you can do it. The question is what you'll choose to do with what you can do." 7 years ago, she had chosen to hide it. Today, she had chosen differently. She didn't know yet what that meant for tomorrow. But the mountains were receding behind the convoy, and the base was ahead, and the radio traffic was normal, and both her injured colleagues were alive, and the ridgelines were clear, and for right now, for this specific stretch of road on this specific afternoon, that was enough. That was more than enough. The convoy reached Phoebe Kestrel at 14:37 hours. Emily was the last one off her vehicle. She unloaded her communications equipment. She logged the frequency data. She filed the signal quality report for the Eastern Array. She did all of this before she did anything else because she was a communications specialist, and those were the tasks of a communications specialist, and she had meant what she said to Mitchell about her role. And when she was done, she walked to the eastern side of the base, to the flat concrete foundation that had once been something else, and she sat down. She looked at the mountains. She looked at them for a long time. She was not counting distances. She was not calculating angles. She was just sitting, and she was thinking about a man who had spent his life preparing her for a moment she had spent 7 years refusing to arrive at. And she was thinking that maybe the most important thing he had ever taught her wasn't how to read wind or calculate elevation or account for barrel temperature. Maybe the most important thing was the thing he had said on the night he gave her his notebook. He had pressed it into her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "You're going to want to put this away somewhere. You can't find it easily. And when the day comes that you need it, you're going to know. You're going to know because the people around you are going to need something that nobody else can give them." She had put it away. She had kept it close enough to carry, but far enough to not look at. And today the people around her had needed something that nobody else could give them. And she had given it. She pressed her palms against the cold concrete and breathed the cold mountain air and let the day settle into her at whatever depth it needed to go. And she let herself feel just briefly, fully, and without apology, what she thought her father might have felt if he could have seen it. Not pride in the shots. He hadn't always said that pride in the shots was the beginning of the wrong kind of thinking. Pride in the choice. The hard choice. The one she had made in the middle of everything, when the easy thing would have been to stay behind the wheel and keep her head down and let the promise hold. She had chosen differently, and it had mattered. And right now, sitting on a cold concrete slab in Afghanistan with the sun dropping behind the peaks, that was the truest thing she knew. She was still sitting on the concrete when Reynolds found her. The sun had moved behind the western peaks, and the base had shifted into its evening rhythm. The particular cadence of a military installation, transitioning from operational tempo to maintenance mode, engines, quieting voices, dropping the smell of food from the mess tent drifting across the yard. Emily had been sitting for 40 minutes and had not moved and had not spoken to anyone. Reynolds sat down next to her, not immediately beside her. He left a few feet of space, the way people do when they understand that someone needs proximity, but not pressure. He sat down and he was quiet for a while, and he looked at the mountains the way she was looking at them, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, and that was fine. "The CO wants to see you at 1800, he said finally. Emily didn't look away from the mountains. "How bad?" she said. "Depends on your perspective," Reynolds said. "Master Chief, Lieutenant Colonel Graves is not a man who likes surprises," Reynolds said. "And today was a very large surprise." Emily processed that. "Am I in trouble?" she said. "You neutralized 5 enemy positions and saved the convoy from what would have been a catastrophic loss. You are not in trouble in the way that ends careers." He paused. "You may be in a different kind of trouble, the kind that comes from people realizing what you are." She turned and looked at him. "That kind of trouble," she said. "Yes." She looked back at the mountains. "My father warned me about that kind of trouble," she said. "I know. He warned me too." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. He said, "The hardest thing about being exceptional is that the world will never let you be quietly exceptional. It will always want to make use of you." She sat with that. "What does Graves want to do with me?" she said. "I don't know yet," Reynolds said, "but I know that Mitchell has already filed a preliminary report, and I know that Mitchell is not a man who files incomplete reports." She looked at him sharply. "What did he write?" she said. "Exactly what happened," Reynolds said. "Every bit of it, including the fact that you predicted the ambush in the briefing and he shut you down." "He did not omit that part." She stared at Reynolds. "He included that," she said. "He included everything," Reynolds said. "The warning in the briefing, the corridor, the ridge, the 5th position." He paused. "He wrote it the way it happened immediately, which, given the kind of man I initially assessed him to be, surprised me, Brim." She turned that over. It surprised her too. And something in her chest that had been tightened against Ryan Mitchell since the moment he threw the radio against the wall began very slowly and without her full permission to loosen. "Is he still on base?" she said. "He's in the debrief with his team," Reynolds said. "He'll be in Graves's office before you are, I suspect." "Okay," she said. She stood up. She looked at the mountains one more time. Then she looked at Reynolds. "Whatever happens in that office," she said, "whatever Graves decides, I need you to understand that I am not going to pretend today didn't happen, and I am also not going to let it define the rest of my service in ways I haven't chosen." Reynolds looked up at her. I understand, he said. Do you? Because I know what you did, Master Chief. I know you arranged this. I know you put me on this mission, and I know you put the equipment on the vehicle, and I know you had a plan, and I am not angry about it. But I need you to understand that whatever comes next is mine to decide. Not yours, not Graves's, mine. He held her gaze. Your father would be proud, he said. My father, she said, would tell you to stop deflecting and answer the question. A pause, and then Reynolds, for what might have been the first time in their acquaintance, smiled. Not a large smile, a small, real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. Yeah, he said, you get to decide. She nodded. She walked toward the command building, and she was ready. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Graves was 54 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in positions where the wrong word at the wrong moment costs lives. He was not dramatic, he was not theatrical. He was a man made of precision and patience and a very fine-tuned understanding of what the military was and what it required and where the boundaries of those requirements ran. I was sitting behind his desk when Emily was shown in, and he did not look up immediately. He was reading something. She recognized Mitchell's handwriting from across the desk. She stood at attention. At ease, Specialist Carter, Graves said without looking up. She relaxed her stance. She waited. He finished reading. He set the document down. He looked at her. I had the kind of eyes that had stopped surprising a long time ago. Eyes that had processed too much to be easily disrupted. He looked at her with those eyes for a moment, reading something in her face that she couldn't have named. Then he said, 5 positions, 18 minutes, maximum engagement distance 940 meters. Yes, sir, she said. Cold Barrel Valley wind, 2 distinct atmospheric conditions between the morning and afternoon engagements. Yes, sir. From vehicle hood support on the final shot. Yes, sir. He leaned back. He looked at her for another long moment. Specialist Carter, he said, I have been in the Army for 32 years. I have known a small number of people who were genuinely gifted in ways that exceeded what training alone can produce. Your father was one of them. He paused. Tell me why I am only learning about you right now. The question was not hostile. It was genuinely curious with a precision to it that suggested he had already considered the available answers and found them insufficient. Because I didn't want to be known for it, sir, she said. Explain. She told him. Not everything, not the way she had told Reynolds or Mitchell, but the relevant version, the trained version. The version that gave him the facts he needed to understand the decision she had made without requiring him to carry the emotional weight of it. She told him about her father's training, about the 10 years of work and the specific nature of what she had been taught, about the promise she had made to her mother and the 7 years she had kept it, about the choice she had made this morning in the valley when the alternative was watching soldiers die on a ridge she had predicted. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. In the warning in the briefing yesterday, he said, Yes, sir. You knew. I assessed a high probability, sir. I would not say I knew. I said what I assessed. And Chief Petty Officer Mitchell shut you down. He did, sir. Graves looked at her. Are you angry about that? He said. She thought about that for a moment. I was, she said. In the moment, yes. Less so now. Why less so? Because he included it in his report, she said. He didn't have to do that. He could have filed a report that was technically accurate without including the context of the briefing. Most people in his position would have. She held Graves's gaze. He didn't, and that tells me something about who he is that changes how I feel about who he was in that briefing. Graves was quiet for a moment. That is a very measured assessment, he said. My father taught me that the measure of a person isn't who they are in the moment they're wrong, she said. It's who they are in the moment they realize it. Graves looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Specialist Carter, I'm going to be direct with you about what happens next. And I want you to listen to all of it before you respond. Yes, sir. What you did today will not be kept quiet. That is not possible, not with the number of people who were present and not with Mitchell's report already in the system. By tomorrow morning, people across this command will know your name and they will know what you did. That is a reality you need to accept. She had already accepted it, but she let him continue. Secondly, he said, I have an obligation to this command and to the soldiers under my command to utilize assets effectively. What you demonstrated today is an asset. I would be failing in my responsibility if I pretended otherwise. She kept her face even. With that said, Graves continued, and his voice shifted slightly, a degree of something that was almost personal. Entering what had been a purely official register, I also have an obligation to the people who serve under me as people, not as assets, not as tools. He looked at her steadily. Which means that before I make any decisions about your role or your assignment, I am going to ask you a question that most commanding officers would not ask, and I am going to expect an honest answer. She waited. What do you want, he said. The question hit her differently than she expected. She had walked in here prepared for a directive, for a decision made above her head and handed down with the quiet absolute authority of rank. She had prepared herself to push back against that if she needed to and to accept it if the pushback failed because that was the nature of service, and she had chosen service. She had not prepared for the question to come back to her. Sir, she said. Specialist Carter, you heard me? What do you want? She looked at him. She thought about what Reynolds had said on the concrete, about what her mother had said on the phone, about what Mitchell had said sitting on the ground beside her vehicle. She thought about what she had said to Mitchell, my job is still comms. And she thought about whether that was still true, whether the morning in the valley had changed that answer, whether the door that had been closed for 7 years could be closed again, or whether it was permanently open now. And the only remaining question was what she chose to walk through it. I want to continue doing my job, she said. Your current job, Graves said, communications. Yes, sir, and I want the people I work with to listen when I identify a threat. Regardless of my role, she held his gaze. Because this morning proved that the threat assessment I provided in the briefing was accurate, and 2 men were airlifted out because the assessment was ignored. I would like that to not happen again. The room was very quiet. Graves looked at her. That's a formal request, he said. Yes, sir, it is. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen, made a note on a pad beside Mitchell's report, and set the pen down. I'll take that under advisement, he said. In the interim, you are relieved of communications duties for 72 hours for medical evaluation and debrief. Standard post-incident protocol. Understood, sir. You are not, however, relieved of your status on this base or your assignment to this unit. I want to be very clear about that. He looked at her. Nothing that happened today changes your assignment unless you want it to. She let out a breath. Thank you, sir, she said. Dismissed Specialist Carter. She came to attention. She turned. She was at the door when Graves spoke again. Carter. She stopped. Your father's file is in the command archives, he said. I pulled it when I first read Mitchell's report, before you came in here. A pause. He was exceptional. Everything the record says about him is true. Another pause, and when he spoke again, something in his voice was different, quieter. The record also shows he put in a request 6 months before his retirement that his daughter's service record be reviewed for potential placement in a more operationally relevant role. The request was denied. Too unspecific, the reviewing officer noted. Insufficient supporting documentation. Emily had her hand on the door. She was very still. I thought you should know that, Graves said. He tried to open the door for you. Officially. 6 months before he died. She didn't turn around. She couldn't turn around right now, and she knew it. Yes, sir, she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. She walked out of the office. She walked down the corridor. She pushed through the exterior door, and she walked to the far side of the building, and she stood against the wall, and she pressed the back of her head against the metal, and she looked straight up at the sky. Her father had filed a request 6 months before he died. He had tried to move the door for her, and the system had told him no, and he had died before he could try again. And she had spent 7 years running from what he had tried to give her. She pressed her hands flat against the wall behind her and breathed. The grief was enormous and specific and real in a way that grief sometimes becomes when a new piece of information organizes everything that came before it into a shape that couldn't be seen until now. She had thought for 7 years that honoring her father's memory meant keeping the promise she had made to her mother. Stepping back from the rifle, choosing a different path. She understood now that her father had a different view of what honoring him looked like. He had tried to file it in writing 6 months before his heart gave out. She stood against the wall until the enormity of it settled to a weight she could carry. Not a weight she was done feeling. Not a weight that would go away tomorrow or next week or possibly ever. But a weight she could stand under. That took 11 minutes, then she pushed off the wall. She walked toward the mess tent because she hadn't eaten since 0500, and her body was sending signals she couldn't ignore anymore. She was halfway across the yard when she heard her name. Carter. She turned. Ryan Mitchell was coming toward her across the yard. Not running, not urgent, just a man who had seen her from a distance and was walking with purpose, the way he walked everywhere with that economical, nothing-wasted movement that she had registered the first time she watched him in the briefing tent. He stopped a few feet from her. She waited. "How'd it go with Graves?" he said. "Fine, sir," she said. He looked at her face for a moment. "You look like someone hit you with something," he said. She almost smiled. "He told me about my father's request," she said. "The one he filed before he died." Mitchell was quiet. "You knew about it," she said. It wasn't a question. Something in his expression had shifted in the specific way that happens when a person recognizes information they already carry. "I read his full file after you told me his name this morning," Mitchell said. "I had time during the hold before we withdrew." He paused. "I saw the request. I saw the denial." Another pause. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "For which part?" she said. He met her eyes. "All of it," he said. "The briefing, the radio, the way I spoke to you before the mission." He didn't look away. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that since we got back. I didn't want to say it like an official apology. I didn't want it to sound like something I said because I had to. I wanted to say it because I mean it." She studied him. "You mean it?" she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The late light was flat and cold, and it made everything look very clear. No softening, no ambiguity. Just the fact of the two of them standing in the yard of a military base in Afghanistan with the weight of the day between them. "I believe you," she said. Something in him relaxed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where the tension breaks like a wave, more like a small internal unclenching. The body releasing something that had been held for a long time. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Mitchell. You made a mistake and you owned it, and you put it in the report when you could have left it out. That's more than most people do." "It's the minimum," he said. "The minimum is not the same as enough." She looked at him. "What does enough look like to you?" she said. He thought about that. "It looks like making sure it doesn't happen again," he said. "Not just with you, with anyone." He held her gaze. "I'm a team leader. I set the standard for how my team treats the people working alongside them. I failed that standard today, and the failure had consequences that I'm going to carry for a long time." She said nothing. "Cortez is going to be all right," Mitchell continued. "Davis, too. They both knew the risk when they signed up. That's true. But the gap between the risk they signed up for and the risk they face today was partly created by decisions I made. And I need to be honest about that." Emily looked at him. She thought about what her father had said about the measure of a person, about the moment they realize they're wrong. "You're being honest about it," she said. "Trying to," he said. "Then we're square," she said. "For what it's worth." He looked at her. "It's worth a lot," he said quietly. She nodded. She started to move. "Carter," he said. She stopped. "I meant what I said at the vehicle. After the firefight." He held her gaze. "You've earned the right to define your own role. And whatever you decide that looks like, I'll back it. For what my backing is worth to you." She considered that. "Tell Graves," she said. "Not me. I already told Graves what I want. If you want to back something, back that." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "What did you tell him?" "That I want to keep doing my job," she said, "and that I want people to listen when I identify a threat." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's it. That's all you asked for." "That's all I needed," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to be able to read. The recalibration look, the one that happened when the version of her he had built in his head collided with the actual version and had to adjust. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She walked to the mess tent. She ate alone, which was how she usually ate, and which felt different tonight than it had yesterday or the night before. Not worse, not better. Different in the way that a familiar room feels different when the light source changes. The same walls, the same furniture, the same space, but everything showing differently. She was still sitting there, the meal finished and the coffee getting cold, when Sergeant Webb came and sat across from her. She looked up. He set down a tray he wasn't going to eat from and looked at her. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. Not for today, he said. For 11 months. I knew your comms work was exceptional. I never asked why. I never asked anything about you that wasn't directly related to the job. And I should have. She looked at him. You treated me professionally, she said. I treated you transactionally, he said. There's a difference and you know it and I know it. He held her gaze to come. I'm asking for a reset. Emily studied him. Marcus Webb was a different kind of man from Ryan Mitchell, where Mitchell was certainty and force in the particular energy of a person who leads from the front by making the front feel inevitable. Webb was steadiness. He was the kind of person who shows up the same way every day, regardless of what the day costs him and who makes the people around him better by simply being consistent. She had respected him for 11 months without ever saying so. Reset, she said. Done. He exhaled. Good, he said. He looked at her coffee cup. You want a fresh one? He said. Yeah, she said. I really do. He got up and got her a fresh coffee, and they sat at the table for 40 minutes and actually talked for the first time in 11 months of working alongside each other. And Emily found to her own mild surprise that she had things to say to Marcus Webb that she had not said to anyone on this base in all the months she had been here. She talked about the communications work, about the specific challenges of the Eastern Array in cold weather and the workaround she had developed that the technical manual didn't account for. He listened like someone who understood what she was describing and wanted to understand it better. He asked questions that were smart and specific. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, in the middle of the mess tent, on an evening in November at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, Emily Carter felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was somewhere she belonged, not because she had proven herself, not because the people around her now knew what she was capable of, but because she was talking about her work with someone who cared about it, and the work was real and it mattered, and that had been true all along. Only now there was a room for her to be fully herself in it, not the reduced version, not the carefully edited version that had kept the rifle locked away and the calculations quiet and the observations to herself because nobody had wanted them. The full version, the one her father had helped build, and the one she was going to have to figure out how to live in going forward. Webb left around 2100. Emily sat alone for a while longer. Then she went to her quarters. She pulled out the satellite phone. It was Thursday. She called her mother. Patricia Carter answered on the second ring the way she always answered the Thursday call, as if she had been holding the phone for the last hour, which Emily suspected she had been. Her mother said, and something in the single syllable of that word, the specific, compressed weight of a mother saying her daughter's name broke through everything Emily had managed to keep contained for the entire day. She didn't cry. That was not how Emily Carter processed things. But something inside her opened up and was quiet in a way that had not been quiet all day. Mom, she said. What happened? Her mother said. Not alarmed, not afraid, just present. The way Patricia Carter had always been present. A lot, Emily said. Are you okay? Yes, she said. And then because this was her mother and there was no one else on earth to whom she would say this, I picked up a rifle today. Silence. Then I know. Emily went very still. What? She said. I know, her mother said again. Reynolds called me about an hour ago. Emily stared at the wall of her quarters. He called you, she said. He has my number, Patricia said. Your father gave it to him years ago. He said if there was ever a day where Emily needed someone to know what happened before she had to explain it herself, call this number. A pause. Today was that day, I think. Emily closed her eyes. Reynolds, of course. 31 years in special operations, and he had planned this too. Not just the assignment and the equipment and the position in the vehicle. He had planned the call to her mother because he had understood that the hardest part of today wouldn't be the valley. It would be the phone call home. She pressed her hand against her eyes. Emily, her mother said. I'm here, she said. He told me what you did. All of it. Her mother's voice was steady, but Emily knew her mother's voice better than she knew almost anything else in the world. And she could hear underneath the steadiness, the specific frequency of a woman who had been sitting alone with a piece of news for an hour. He told me the soldiers who are alive because of what you did. Emily didn't speak. Your father, her mother said and stopped. She started again. Your father used to say that the greatest gift a parent can give a child is a capability that saves someone else's life. He said that once. When you were small, I didn't understand what he meant then. Emily's throat was tight. I understand now, Patricia said. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was full of every year and every deployment and every fishing rod still in the garage. It was full of 10 years of training in the mountains of eastern Tennessee and a notebook pressed into a daughter's hands and a request filed with the Army 6 months before a heart gave out. It was full of a promise made and kept for 7 years and then set aside for the right reason at the right moment. It was full of Daniel Carter, who had been gone for 6 years and was somehow specifically and stubbornly present in this moment. Mom, Emily said. I know, her mother said. I know, baby. They stayed on the line for a long time without speaking much, and that was enough, and it was more than enough. And Emily Carter sat on the edge of her bunk in Afghanistan with the phone against her ear and her father's notebook at the bottom of her bag in the mountains outside, going dark in the cold, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day in the safest place she knew, her mother's voice. Still there, still steady, still holding. She slept for 6 hours, which was more than she had expected. When she woke at 04:30, it was still dark, and the base was in as quiet as phase, that narrow window between the end of the night shift's active period and the beginning of the morning's operational tempo, where the only sounds were the low mechanical hum of generators and the distant movement of sentries doing their rounds. Emily lay on her bunk for exactly 4 minutes looking at the ceiling, and then she got up. She pulled on her running clothes. She ran her 5 miles in the dark. She came back, showered, made her bunk with the automatic precision of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Put on her uniform, sat on the edge of the bed, picked up her father's notebook. She had carried it for 12 years without reading most of it. She had read the first 2 pages the night before the mission and then closed it and not opened it again. Now she opened it to where she had stopped, and she read. Her father's handwriting was small and exact and slightly left slanted, and she had known it since childhood. Reading it felt like hearing his voice at a distance, like a radio signal coming through with interference, mostly clear, but with gaps where the static took over. He had written about technique in mathematics and the physics of long-range ballistics. He had written about weather reading and environmental assessment. He had written about patience in a way that was almost philosophical paragraphs, about what patience really was and what most people confused it with, and she recognized in those paragraphs the voice of a man who had spent a long time thinking carefully about the things most people take for granted. And then about a third of the way through the notebook, the technical writing stopped, and her father started writing about her. She had not known this was in the notebook. She had not known because she had never gotten far enough. The entries were not dated. They were written in a different pen, a darker ink, as if they had been added over time rather than in a single sitting. They were short, most of them, observations more than letters, the specific notations of a man who was trying to capture something before it escaped. The first one read, Emily today at 15. She made the 640 shot in the full crosswind. She didn't celebrate. She just recalculated for the next one. I don't know where she learned that kind of composure. I hope it was from me. I'm afraid it was from watching What This Work Costs. She read that 3 times. Then she kept going. Entry after entry, years of them, her father watching her, noting what he saw, trying to put into words the thing he was building in her and the thing he worried he was also taking from her. He wrote about the day she asked him why he trained her and his answer, and how she had listened to the answer with the careful, neutral attention she always brought to things she was processing, and how he had understood in that moment that she was going to carry this gift like a weight rather than a wing, and that there was nothing he could do about that except keep teaching her and trust that eventually she would find her own reason. He wrote about the promise she made to her mother after his retirement. He had known about the promise before she made it. Patricia had told him she was going to ask for it, and he had said to Patricia, let her. She needs to choose it herself. If we ask her not to promise, she'll carry the gift as an obligation, and that's the worst kind of carrying. Let her put it down. She'll pick it up when she's ready. Patricia had told him that didn't seem fair to Emily. And he had said, none of this is fair to Emily. But training her and then taking the choice away from her would be worse. She has to come to it on her own terms, or it means nothing. Emily sat with that for a long time. Her father had known. He had always known that the promise would eventually break. Not because Emily was weak or because promises didn't matter, but because he had built something into her that was stronger than the promise. He had built the instinct to protect, and he had understood, with the patience of a man who had spent his career waiting for the right moment to act, that the instinct would eventually be stronger than the restraint. He had just hoped he would be alive to see it. The last entry in the notebook was brief. 4 sentences. The ink was different from all the others, fresher looking, as if it had been written close to the end. It read, "I don't know how much time I have left. The doctors are not optimistic, and I have decided to believe them because that is the most useful thing I can do with their information. If Emily reads this after I'm gone, I want her to know that the rifle was never the gift. The gift was the person I watched become while she was learning what the rifle was for. She can put the rifle down anytime she wants. She can never put down who she is. And who she is will be enough. It has always been enough." Emily closed the notebook. She sat very still. Outside, the base was beginning to wake up. She could hear the first sounds of the morning shift, changing voices and engines, and the particular percussion of a military installation coming back to life. She held the notebook against her chest for a moment. Then she put it back in her bag. She stood up. She went to work. The 72-hour stand-down that Graves had ordered meant she wasn't managing live communications, but it did not mean there was nothing to do. She spent the morning in the communications bay running diagnostics on the Eastern Array, the work she had promised herself she would complete before the mission had interrupted everything. The array had developed a minor frequency drift in the upper UHF band that could become a significant problem in cold weather, and she traced the drift to a connector that had been installed slightly off-spec during a field repair 3 months earlier. She fixed it in an hour and a half. Private First Class Jordan Tate, who was the youngest member of the communications team and had been at FOB Kestrel for only 8 weeks, watched her do it with the focused attention of someone trying to learn. He had been watching her all morning. She had noticed but hadn't said anything. Finally, when the connector was replaced and she was running the verification diagnostic, he said, "Specialist Carter." She looked at him. "I was 22 years old, and he had the specific quality of someone who had come into the Army with a genuine desire to be good at something and had not yet been in long enough to develop the practiced nonchalance that covers that desire in older soldiers." "What is it, Tate?" she said. "Is it true what they're saying happened yesterday?" he said. She kept her eyes on the diagnostic readout. "Depends on what they're saying," she said. "That you," he stopped, started again, "that you took out the positions on the ridge, the ones that were hitting the convoy." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's true." He was quiet for a beat that was slightly too long, and she recognized the quality of the silence, which was the silence of someone revising a question they had planned to ask, because the real question was more personal than they had anticipated. "How did you know how to do that?" he said. "I mean, your comms. How did you—" "My father taught me," she said, simply, without drama. "Was he—" "He was a sniper with the 75th Rangers," she said, "and then with special operations. He was very good at his job, and he spent 10 years making sure I understood what he knew." Tate absorbed that. "But you chose comms," he said. "I chose comms," she said. "Why was I?" She looked at him. He met her eyes with the earnestness of someone who genuinely wanted to understand and was not asking to be provocative or disrespectful. "Because the thing my father taught me wasn't really about the rifle," she said. "It was about paying attention, about reading a situation completely rather than partially, about understanding what information means before you act on it." She paused. "Those skills work in communications too, maybe better in some ways. Because in communications, your job is to keep everyone connected, to keep the information flowing, to make sure that the people who need to talk to each other can talk to each other when it matters most. That requires the same kind of total situational awareness, just applied differently." Tate thought about that. "So you weren't hiding," he said. "I was hiding," she said, "but not from the skills, from the identity. There's a difference." He looked at her. "The identity," he said. "The sniper," she said. "I didn't want to be the sniper because my father was the sniper and I watched what it cost him over a lifetime, and I loved him enough to not want that cost for myself." She went back to the diagnostic readout. "What I didn't understand for a long time was that who my father was wasn't just a function of the rifle. The rifle was a tool. Who he was, the patience, the perception, the absolute commitment to protecting the people around him, that was him. And I was never going to be able to put that down no matter how far I walked from the rifle." The diagnostic completed. Green across the board. The array was clean. She began shutting down the test equipment. Yesterday, Tate said carefully, when you picked it up, were you scared? She stopped what she was doing. She turned and looked at Private First Class Jordan Tate, who was 22 years old and had been in Afghanistan for 8 weeks and was asking a question that most people who had been here much longer hadn't asked her. Yes, she said, but not of the shots. Then what? Of what it meant to take them, she said. Of what it meant about who I am and what I'm going to do with that going forward. He was quiet. Did you figure it out? He said. She picked up the test equipment and set it on the shelf. I'm working on it, she said. She left the communications bay. She was crossing the yard toward the mess tent when Mitchell fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming, which was mildly irritating because she generally heard people coming. Graves approved it, he said. She looked at him. Approved what? She said. Your request, the formal acknowledgement that communications personnel with specialized tactical knowledge will be included in mission threat assessments going forward. He's putting it in the standing operating procedures for this unit. Mitchell looked straight ahead as he walked. He also sent a copy to CENTCOM with a recommendation that the policy be considered at command level. Emily stopped walking. Mitchell stopped too. She stared at him. He sent it to CENTCOM, she said, with a full summary of yesterday's engagement, including the briefing incident and its consequences. Mitchell held her gaze. Your name is attached. Your father's name is attached. The outcome is attached. All of it. She didn't know what to do with that. I backed it, Mitchell said. I submitted a separate statement. My team submitted statements as well, all of them. He paused. Cortez submitted his from the medical facility this morning. He dictated it because his right hand is bandaged. He still submitted it. Emily pressed her lips together. Mitchell, she said. Carter, he said. I told you to tell Graves. I didn't say start a campaign. You told me to back it, he said. This is how I back things. She looked at him. He looked back. And this time in the flat morning light of the base yard, she could see clearly what had been building in Ryan Mitchell's expression since the day before. It was not admiration in the simple sense. It was not the uncomplicated respect of a soldier for a capability. It was something more earned than that, more specific and more hard-won, the respect of a person who has had to significantly revise their understanding of someone and has done the revision honestly. Thank you, she said. She meant it simply, and he received it simply. Don't thank me yet, he said. CENTCOM being involved means people are going to want things from you that you might not want to give. I know. Are you ready for that? She thought about the notebook, about her father's last 4 sentences. I don't know, she said, but I'll handle it. He nodded. They walked to the mess tent together. It was not a dramatic moment. It was 2 soldiers walking across a base yard in the morning, which was one of the most ordinary things that happened on a military installation. And yet something about the ordinariness of it felt significant, felt like the specific kind of progress that doesn't announce itself, but that you recognize later when you look back and see the line between the before and the after. She had been here before, in a manner of speaking. The before was 11 months of being the quietest person on the base, the one nobody noticed, the one who fixed the array and kept the channels open and ran 5 miles in the dark because discipline was what you did when everything else was uncertain. The after was harder to define, but it existed, and she was standing in it. 3 days later, the formal after-action review convened in the main briefing tent. It was a larger gathering than the standard post-mission review. Graves was there, Mitchell and his full team, Reynolds sitting in the back row with the specific stillness of a man who had arranged everything and was content to observe the results. Webb at the communications station, the medical officer who had treated Davis and Cortez, and 2 officers Emily didn't recognize who had arrived that morning on a flight she hadn't been informed about. She found out who they were when Graves introduced them. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, Special Operations Command, and Major Derek Yoon from the Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group. They had flown in from Bagram. Emily kept her face even. She sat straight. The review proceeded in order. The timeline of the mission was reconstructed from radio logs and individual accounts. The terrain assessment was presented. The briefing incident was documented formally with Mitchell, speaking to it directly without flinching, without softening. His team corroborated. Then Graves turned to Emily. Specialist Carter, he said, please walk us through your assessment of the threat from the initial briefing observation through the final engagement. She walked them through it, every step. the terrain analysis she had done in the briefing, the bird displacement she had observed 41 minutes into the convoy movement, the decision to call it on the radio and the override she had received, the rifle, the kit, the setup behind the rear tire, the first position, the second, the third, the fourth, the calculations she had run for the fifth position during the withdrawal prep, the shot from the vehicle hood at 940 meters. The room was very quiet throughout. When she finished, Colonel Hendricks was looking at her with an expression that Emily recognized because she had seen it before in Reynolds' face on that first morning when she had caught him watching her from across the yard. The expression of someone whose assessment of a situation has just fundamentally changed and who is deciding what to do with the change. Specialist Carter, Hendricks said. How long did the full engagement take all 5 positions start to finish? Approximately 93 minutes between the first shot and the last, Emily said. But that includes the 37-minute withdrawal prep period and the 12 minutes of transit. Active engagement time on the positions was approximately 18 minutes. 18 minutes, Hendricks said. Yes, ma'am. 5 positions, multiple wind conditions, cold barrel on the initial shots, variable distances up to 940 meters. Yes, ma'am. And you haven't touched a rifle in 7 years. The room seemed to breathe in very slightly. No, ma'am, Emily said. I had not. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Graves. Then she looked at Reynolds in the back row, who said nothing and showed nothing and looked exactly as he had looked when he sat down. Then she looked back at Emily. Specialist Carter, she said. We came here to discuss a policy recommendation that Lieutenant Colonel Graves submitted to CENTCOM, but I think we're going to need to have a larger conversation. Emily held her gaze. I'm happy to have whatever conversation is useful, ma'am, she said. I want to be direct about one thing first, if I may. Hendricks nodded. I am a communications specialist, Emily said. That is my role, and I am good at it, and I intend to continue being good at it. Whatever conversation we have about yesterday needs to start from that foundation. I am not seeking a different role. I am not applying for a different designation. What I am asking for is the same thing I asked Lieutenant Colonel Graves, that the assessment I provide in whatever context I provide, it be taken seriously, regardless of my rank or my MOS. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Emily had not expected. Your father made a similar statement, Hendricks said. In his evaluation for the sniper program, he wrote that his goal was not to be defined by the rifle, but to be useful. He said the rifle was one way of being useful, and he intended to find others. Emily's breath caught. You knew my father, she said. I served alongside him once, Hendricks said. Briefly, long enough to know that what he had was not common, and long enough to know that he talked about his daughter. A pause. He said she was going to be better than him. He said it the way people say things they are completely certain of. The room was very still. Emily pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her. He was biased, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Probably, Hendricks said, but he wasn't wrong. The after-action review continued for another hour. At the end of it, Graves announced that the policy change would be formalized at the unit level immediately and forwarded to CENTCOM for command-wide consideration. Hendricks made no specific commitments, but said that the asymmetric warfare group would review the engagement data. It was not a resolution. It was not the clean ending that stories sometimes have. It was the beginning of a longer process. The kind of process that military institutions move through slowly and with great deliberation, and Emily knew better than to expect it to be otherwise. She also knew with the certainty of someone who has spent a long time being patient that the process had started. And starting was the hardest part. After the room cleared, Reynolds waited. He was the last one, as she had suspected he would be. He waited until everyone else had filed out, until even Graves had gathered his documents and nodded to Emily and left. And then Reynolds was just sitting in the back row of the empty briefing tent with his hands on his knees and his patient, steady expression. Emily walked to the back of the tent. She sat down next to him, not with a few feet of space between them, the way he had sat on the concrete. Directly next to him, the way you sit next to someone you have decided to stop keeping a professional distance from. Hendricks knew him, she said. I know, Reynolds said. I called her before we came here. She turned and looked at him. You called her, she said. I thought it would be useful for the people in that room to understand what Daniel Carter was, not just what his file said. He paused. I thought it would be useful for you to hear it from someone who wasn't me. She looked at him for a long moment. You planned every single piece of this, she said. Not every piece, he said. I planned the opening. You did the rest. She thought about that. My father told you to, she said. Reynolds was quiet. He didn't tell me to, he said carefully. He told me that if there ever came a time when I was in a position to open the door, I should open it. He said he trusted that you would walk through on your own terms. And if I hadn't, she said, if the mission had gone wrong in a different way, if I had kept the promise and stayed behind the wheel. Reynolds looked at her steadily. Then I would have respected that, he said, and I would have accepted that I had misread the situation. He paused. But I didn't misread it, because you didn't stay behind the wheel. She held his gaze. No, she said, I didn't. They sat in the empty tent for a few more minutes, not saying much, and the silence was comfortable in the way that silences become when the people sharing them have said everything that actually needed saying, and what remains is just the fact of being in the same place together. Then Emily said, I'm going to call my mother tonight and tell her about Hendrix. She'll want to hear that, Reynolds said. She'll cry, Emily said. She cries when she hears things about my father from people who knew him. She thinks she shouldn't, and she always does anyway. That's not weakness, Reynolds said. I know, Emily said. She knows too. She cries anyway. Reynolds smiled, that small, real smile. She sounds like a woman worth knowing, he said. She's the strongest person I know, Emily said. And then because it was true and she had not said it to anyone in a very long time, she's why I came back from my father's death functional. She held everything together. She is still holding everything together. She just does it quietly because that's how she is. And most people who know me have no idea how much of what I am is her. Reynolds looked at her. Then she did something right, he said. Emily nodded. She stood up. She looked at Reynolds, who was still sitting, who was still steady, who had been steady through all of this with the consistency of something built to last. Master Chief, she said. Carter, he said. Thank you for what you did, for all of it. She held his gaze, and for knowing my father well enough to know what he would have wanted. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. He would have wanted to be here, he said simply. That's the only thing he would have wanted that I couldn't give him. She nodded. She walked out of the tent. The base was in the middle of its afternoon rhythm, and the air was cold and clear, and the mountains were visible from everywhere. The way they always were, the way they had been every day for 11 months, constant and enormous and completely indifferent to everything that happened at their feet. She stopped walking. She looked at the mountains. She thought about something her father had said to her on the last training session they had ever done together, the last time they had gone out to the property in eastern Tennessee with the ridge system and the range markers and the variable wind. She had been 21 years old and about to ship to her first posting, and she had made her last shot of the session and put the rifle down, and her father had stood beside her for a long time without saying anything. And then he had said, whatever you decide to do with this, I need you to know that the best shot I ever made wasn't on a range or in a field. The best shot I ever made was you. Getting you right took more patience, more calculation, more adjustment for conditions, more willingness to wait for the right moment than anything else I ever did. And you turned out exactly as I intended. She had not known what to say. She still didn't. But she understood it now in a way she hadn't at 21. She understood that her father had been talking about something larger than training. He had been talking about love, which is always the longest range shot, the one with the most variables, the one that requires the most patience and the most trust in the calculation and the most willingness to let go at the moment of release and believe that what you've built will carry. He had let go, and she had carried. And she was still carrying and would carry for the rest of her life the 10 years of early morning sessions and wind calculations and the smell of gun oil and the sound of his voice telling her to account for the cold. Always account for the cold because the rifle tells you the truth eventually, but it starts by telling you about temperature. She would carry the notebook. She would carry the 4 sentences he had written when he knew he was running out of time. She would carry the fishing rods in her mother's garage, which she had decided standing here on this base in Afghanistan that she was going to take out of the garage when she got home. She was going to take them to the river that her father had always planned to take them, to the one he had described to her in specific detail on one of his returns between deployments, as if mapping it from memory. The bend in the river where the water slowed and the light came through at the right angle. In the late afternoon, the place he had always intended to go with her. She was going to go there. She was going to bring her mother. She was going to sit on the bank of that river with her mother and the fishing rods her father never got to use, and she was going to let the afternoon go as long as it needed to go. And she was going to understand fully and without apology that she was the daughter of Daniel Carter, who had been exceptional, and that being his daughter was not a burden she carried or a shadow she lived in. It was a gift. It had always been a gift. She just had to be ready to receive it. She was ready now. She turned away from the mountains. She walked back across the base. She went to the communications bay. She checked the eastern array. It was running clean. She sat down at her station, put on her headset, and opened the primary channel. "This is Carter," she said. "Forward comms, FOB Kestrel. All stations radio check. Over." The responses came back one by one, clean and clear. Every voice in its right place, the network intact, the connections holding. She logged them. She sat back. She was a communications specialist. She kept people talking when everything tried to make them go silent. She read the terrain that other people missed. She carried a gift she had spent 7 years putting down and had finally in a valley in Afghanistan with the northwest wind at 14 miles per hour and 5 enemy positions on a ridgeline that nobody else had accounted for picked back up. She was her father's daughter. She was her mother's daughter. She was a soldier who had made a promise and kept it for 7 years and then made a harder, truer choice when keeping it would have cost more than breaking it. She was Emily Carter, and she was exactly who she had always been preparing.